and welcome back, and welcome aboard. It's so nice to finally have the time to make another video. I'll be honest, when I first started the channel, it was a spur-of-the-moment type deal, and one that I thought I'd make a handful of videos, see how it went. But as with us all, life got busy. And during that time, I received a surprising amount of feedback and requests for new videos. So after multiple requests and quite a bit of waiting, here's a new one. One that I hope to fulfill the requests and hopefully continue to make these as we go forward. There was a request for some more instrument-related videos. However, I decided to do something a little different for this one, but there will be some more to come related to instrument topics. For today, I thought we would look over this CAE created LearJet 3536 operator's manual. It's a CAE created checklist, and one that many would argue is superior to the Bombardier manufactured one. However, we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. As you can see off to the left, I have a Gemini Jets 200 scale Gulfstream 650 ER. Just a little something to add to the frame. Obviously, this checklist has nothing to do with that airplane, but I thought it made it look quite nice. We'll talk about the G650 in a future video. So, as I stated, this is a operator's manual, a training checklist created by CAE, which, for those of you who don't know, CAE is one of several professional aviation training centers. They do a lot of simulator training for all types of airplanes. Everything from a Beechcraft, a beach jet, to a Boeing business jet, to a E-170, 75. So them in flight safety tend to be the top two in the industry. I hid my name under this piece of paper, that's why it's blocked out. So this portion of the checklist is a pretty decent and thorough exterior pre-flight inspection, which they generally have you start on the captain's side in front of the entry door. You would inspect all surfaces, protective coverings, make sure the pitot tube covers have been taken off, the static port covers. No. The Lear 35A is a very storied bird. The aircraft itself stems from the Lear 20 series. The Lear 25, which is very much it is a very similar plane to the Lear 35 and subsequent Lear 35A, but it had different engines on it, different autopilot, a little bit of a different electrical system and so on, but it is a continuation of the Lear 20 series onto the Lear 30 series. Now, they made over 700 Lear 35As, which is why today, despite going out of production, I believe in 1992, it's no difficult task to find Lear 35As that are still flying. They're very popular in South and Central America, as well as a very popular air ambulance airplane used in the continental United States as well as Alaska. They are not terribly expensive to acquire. Bombardier still supports the airplane quite well, and their cost of operation, relatively speaking, is actually very low compared to something like a Phenom 300 or 100, I guess would be its closer competitor. And the Lear today still can do things that not a lot of business jets in its size segment can do as well. I guess I should preface all of this by saying I have well over 1,000 hours in Lear 35As alone. So it's a bird that is near and dear to my heart, and one I'm sure we'll talk about again in the future. So this obviously continues the exterior pre-flight. An interesting tidbit of information about the Lear is the 35s actually went through several different wing modifications. The original wing actually was several inches shorter, and then they extended it out, added vortex generators, which have a pretty substantial drag penalty at high speeds, I believe. And then the final version, which is pretty much the most common wing you'll find on a Lear 30 series today, is the Century 3 wing with soft light, which is that it has a stall fence. I'm sorry, no, that's the Lear 31 I'm thinking of. It has these boundary BLEs, boundary layer energizers, these 3 rows, as well as a stall strip, which helps with efficiency and stall handling characteristics. And there's actually even more modifications or more things that have been done to the wing, including what's called the bat wing, which drastically improves payload capacity. I believe it brings the Century 3 wing up to from 18.5 to 19,600 pounds. So, which is obviously over 1,000 pounds of increased payload. It also added strakes to the tail, which really helps with stall recovery. We'll continue going through this. Obviously, we're not going to go through this entire manual. Otherwise, this would be a 6-hour video if I spent the time talking about every single item. Let's see, it's talking about the tip tanks. These tip tanks are really what give the airplane its range. The airplane itself is over 4 hour to 5 hour bird. It is quite incredible. The Lear 35 generally can fly longer than you want to be in it, which is what makes it one of the things that makes it such an interesting bird. None of these items are generally spurring my interest to talk about. For those of you who watch the channel who are pilots or even just enthusiasts who know a thing or two about airplanes, even if it's a Skyhawk to a Lear, there are a lot more things in common with it than there are differences. So I really don't see the need to talk about things like, pitot tubes and fuel vents, a sump drain, of which there are many on the belly of the Lear, but we generally, as pilots, only concern ourselves with the fuel vents and the fuel computer drains as well. And these checks as well. This is in the manufacturer's checklist, the Bombardier checklist. These checklists would be considered the before starting engines check. So power on checks, you're checking to ensure the batteries have proper voltage, your AC power inverters are working properly, as well as your emergency battery as well. Your cabin inspection, ensuring that any baggage is secured. most of your baggage is carried behind the bench in the back. That's where the bulk of it is. Some Lears have a aft external tail baggage locker underneath the tail, and that does actually help quite a bit when you're carrying quite a number of bags. Here it mentions ensuring your emergency exit aisle cleared, obstructed, which can be an issue if you have a lot of bags. You don't want to be blocking the aisleway with baggage. That's definitely not a good thing, nor is it legal. By looking at this checklist, see it has power on checks, cabin inspection followed by before starting engine. So they've separated what is a single checklist from the manufacturer. Before starting checks, we'd ensure the cabin air damper knob switch is set to its appropriate setting, open or closed. It's in the back of the airplane. You check your oxygen masks, your circuit breakers, control locks, seat belts, solar harnesses, flight controls, alternate static source switch, just a lot of checking of switches. The really amazing thing about modern day airplanes is the bulk of these checks are done by a computer automatically. A couple of switches when you power up the aircraft, and the bulk of this is verified by a computer. That's not to say it's better. Those systems have plenty of problems themselves, but more on that later. Now, since I've already caught that I've made a mistake in terms of saying which checklist is which, I should tell you that this checklist is, it's got a bit of a storied past. This checklist was created by CAE in Dallas, and they've been teaching the Lear 35 since the 80s. In fact, it was only recently that they stopped teaching the Lear 35. It's the program no longer is at CAE anymore. So they've got a lot of experience though with this airplane, and at some point they decided to assemble their own checklist. Now this checklist is one of those checklists that would be for training only. However, they had authorization to allow you to use this checklist in the simulator. And over the years, there were operators that were utilizing this checklist instead of the manufacturer's checklist when they operated the airplane. This checklist, to the best of my understanding, was never approved by the FAA for that purpose. It was a training supplement only. Ultimately, there was a Lear 35 that crashed a number of years ago at Teterboro, and the operator was found to have been using this checklist. I don't know exactly what issue the FAA took with it, but they determined that was absolutely not allowed, and this checklist is actually, I believe CAE doesn't even allow you to use, didn't allow you to use this checklist anymore. This checklist does have some strengths, in my opinion, particularly as it relates to emergency procedures and abnormal procedures. That's where the strength of this checklist is. The normal procedure stuff isn't really all that much better. I think Kate's LearJet and eventually Bombardier got it right. And that's the checklist that, obviously I use and have been using, especially, even long before the FAA said no. I'm sorry, it's a checklist I was using, but that's a different story, different airplane. Then we move along to starting engines. This is just your normal procedures checklist. As you can see, starting engines before taxi, taxi before takeoff, runway lineup. So, runway lineup, for example, would, as soon as we're given the takeoff clearance, we'd go ahead and turn the pitot heat on, which on the 30 series Lears is on the captain's side. In the 55 and the 60 and subsequent Lears, they did a better job at ergonomically designing the airplane to ensure that both crew members can reach the bulk of the switches at any given time. Because obviously if you're the pilot flying, or in this case you're the captain, you don't want to be having to turn on switches as you're taking the runway. That should be the pilot monitoring's job. So, we're clear for takeoff. We'll turn the pitot heat on, air ignition, stall warnings. The interesting side note about the stall warnings is that which should be off already. Landing lights and taxi lights will come on. Recognition and strobe lights would come on. The steering lock, which is a nose wheel steering button, you'll disengage that by holding down on the red control wheel master switch on the yoke. That way it's essentially not locked. The moment you take your finger off that switch, it'll disengage. And then here we move on. Warning lights. You want to make sure your annunciator panel is indicating the appropriate things. If something like you've got your wing and stab heat on. And then last, on your takeoff roll, when airspeed alive is called by your pilot monitoring, you'll release that control wheel master switch I mentioned, and you'll be maintaining your directional control via the rudder and some aileron if there's winding conditions. You'll speed up, roll down the runway at 80 knots. The pilot monitoring calls 80 knots, verifies, cross-checks the instruments, makes sure everything's agreed and the panel's clean. No reason to abort at V1. You'll call V1 shortly thereafter, rotation speed, and V2, to which we then will have our call-outs of gear up, yaw dampener on, 400 feet we clean up, call for the after takeoff checklist, and then these are the rest of your checklists all the way to landing or go around. To shut down, quick turnaround, etc. But these are, like I said, these are all your normal procedures. Here we have a takeoff trim CG function chart. Something we generally don't. This is for determining a trim setting based on your center of gravity percentage. Which the nice thing in the Lear 35 is there's a takeoff trim window. You want to make sure your trim is set somewhere within that. It's difficult to explain without a picture of it, but essentially as long as your takeoff trim light is not on, you should be okay, but there are things you can do to maybe help yourself and trim more correctly or more precisely for whatever your center of gravity situation is. Temperature conversion, sure, these are all reference materials. Maximum continuous thrust for N1 on your standard nozzle. Standard nozzle, it would be a no thrust reverser. On the Lear, we have two types of thrust reversers. On the Lear 30 series, we have one for the Lear 35, 35A. The Lear 31 is only one kind. The Lear 35, 35A had either a Ronca or a D. Howard clamshell type thrust reversers. I've flown both. The D. Howard clamshells are more effective and a little bit quicker into deploy. Generally speaking, a lot of operators and pilots consider it more reliable. However, the Aranca thrust reverser airplanes I've flown, I've actually myself never really had many issues with them. I just find the D. Howards deploy faster and are a little bit more effective. And as you can see, standard nozzle, then max continuous thrust for D. Howard thrust reversers, and then thrust settings for the Aranca thrust reversers. And these here takeoff your VRV2 for given weight, outside air temperature, and flaps 8 or 20 setting in the Lear 30 series, as well as the 55. You can take off with either flaps 8 or flaps 20, or either way are both appropriate. Takeoff flap settings. There is flaps 8 is the generally preferred, and normally you don't really have to take off flaps 20 in a Lear 35, but if you're in a 55, it's prudent oftentimes to do flaps 20. You get better, shorter takeoff roll, so you'll get off the ground quicker, but you do have a greater drag penalty, and should you lose an engine, you run the risk of not gaining the, more or less, the second segment performance, or from the cycles, which I'm not really going to spend too much time on here. Fuel flow, pounds per hour, given airspeed at various flight levels. So you can monitor, for flight planning purposes, figure what your fuel burn is going to be. The Lear 35 is such an older bird, so much flight time that the profiles that you might find on electronic flight bags are pretty accurate, especially if you're flying a more traditional Lear 35A that hasn't been all modded out. Plus, most Lears have at least one FMS. Universal is the standard, and that gives you some fuel burn, fuel flow on board. There is an analog fuel flow gauge on the panel, but it's notorious for being unreliable and inaccurate. Landing distances, flaps 40, which is flaps full. You can do a no-flap landing. There's nothing that says you can't, but we don't generally have numbers. However, I believe our final approach speed is ref plus 30, if memory serves. Might have to look at the checklist, which, hey, we got one right here. Alright, so here we have anything that's in red. It means it has memory items. And everything else is an emergency procedure that doesn't necessarily have, it doesn't have memory items, but something like cabin cockpit fire smoke or fumes is going to usually necessitate your oxygen mask smoke goggles on, turn on the oxymec switch, establish two-way communication, and then, generally speaking, initiate an emergency descent, which in the Lear 35 is engines to idle, spoilers out, landing gear down, and then pitch down for VMO or MMO, which MMO is 0.81, VMO is 350 till 8,000, then it goes down to 300. Now, the Lear 31 and 55 and the 60, I believe, the procedure is roughly the same, except for you don't put the landing gear down. The reason why we put the landing gear down in the Lear 35 is because of our tip tanks. The landing gear themselves adds some stability, what's known as a keel effect. Because we have those tip tanks hanging out there, and especially if they're full of fuel, we jokingly call them anti-roll devices. They make the control inputs tend to be heavier, and so that landing gear kind of helps keep it a little bit more stable as you maneuver and go downward. It does increase drag, though, as well, the landing gear, which is good. That's what you're looking for. As an example, here's another red box memory item. If we had an engine failure during takeoff below V1, V1 is decision speed, which means for academic purposes, let's say we hit, we'll say 120 is our V1 speed today. So at 120 V1, the decision has been made that if something were to happen, like an engine failure or fire, we will still go fly. It is, if we try and stop the airplane, there is a high probability we do not have the runway remaining, and that will ultimately guarantee our demise. At V1, we've essentially committed ourselves to taking the aircraft in the air. But in this case, we're seeing engine fails below V1. At that point, we'll abort the takeoff by going thrust levers to idle, wheel brake supply, and extend our spoilers. From there, all these items like drag chute or thrust reversers, if installed, deploy, or if necessary. Another thing you do have to remember, if you have the D-Howards, I don't believe the Arankas work, but I'm getting a little bit into my systems knowledge right now. But I know for sure with the D-Howard you can have asymmetrical TR deployment on the ground. So if you use a TR to one TR to slow down, there's going to be a lot of asymmetrical reverse thrust to overcome. So you do, if you're high speed aboard, you do run the risk of, especially in something like a Lear 35 with its tip tanks, if they're full, you do run the risk of losing directional control. Now, V1 is calculated based on the assumption of no spoilers, no TRs, no thrust reversers, just wheel braking. So unless the situation really necessitated it, I would be very resistant to do anything but apply the brakes. Engine failure during approach. This one, control wheel master switch to press thrust. Operating engine increase as required to maintain your safe airspeed. Flaps 20 maximum, so you won't go flaps full, because at that point you go flaps full, you're committed to land. There's just simply no option for a go around. There's too much drag. And then your airspeed will be a ref plus 10 minimum. Now, there are charts and tables that we can utilize to calculate ref, but the rule of thumb for your standard Lear 35 is your basic reference speed, which is 1.3 VSO. VSO being stall speed in a landing configuration, is 105. And from there, you add 5 knots for every 1,000 pounds of fuel. So let's say we have 2,000 pounds on board. That brings our reference speed up to 115. And then for every person that's on board, you add 1 extra knot. So we'll say there's 4 people on board, including us, the pilots. So that's 4 people, so 4 knots plus 115, 119. Our reference speed is going to be 119, and we want to try and touch down right around 119 or so. But our approach speed will be 119 plus 10, the ref plus 10 minimum, so 129 will be our approach speed. These segments are highlighted because they're important notes of limitations. So, for example, with a go-around 1 or 2 engines, if you have less than 600 pounds of fuel in either wing, a prolonged nose-up attitude of 10 or more may cause fuel starvation and engine flame up, because all the fuel, because of the nose-up attitude, is going to flow aft. It's a wet wing. The whole wing is a tank, a fuel tank, and it's going to all flow aft. And the fuel is scavenged from intakes toward the front root of the wing. So if there's no fuel up there, there's going to be no fuel to the engines, and then you're going to go ahead and find yourself flying a very heavy glider. Sorry, just adjusting my seat. This is the relay envelope for engine air starts. I don't really feel like talking about that. It's interesting as I go through this manual with all of you. There's part of me that feels like I'm a bit on a check ride talking about these, but not in an unpleasant way. Let's see. So one of the nice things about these tabs is it helps us get to a page quicker based on the issue. So let's say, for example, we have well, we talked about a no-flap landing, so that'll be most likely under landing abnormal all the way in the back. So let's see, hydraulic failure, alternate gear extension. I believe that still follows, that's hydraulic. There's a very lovely hydraulic system diagram. We're not going to talk about that. Let's see, emergency braking, nose wheel steering malfunction, both engines inoperative landing. So if we had a flame out, most likely caused by, like I said, that 10 degrees nose up for prolonged periods with less than 600 pounds of fuel, or if you just did poor flight planning and tipped into your reserves till you exhausted your fuel. So in this example, we'll say the engine's flamed out. We're at 10,000 feet. The airplane's best glide speed in a clean configuration is ref plus 60. The still air gliding distance is approximately 2 nautical miles per 1,000 feet of altitude, which is not bad. If time is permitting, you'll squawk 7700, that's your general emergency squawk code. You'll advise air traffic control, tell the passengers that it's about to get pretty interesting. No smoking, fasten seatbelt sign on, because, that's important. Your fuel jettison switch on if tips contain fuel, because you want to jettison that fuel and land as light as possible. prop switch will be on, which will provide the hydraulic power needed to actuate your brakes as well as your landing gear. Let's see, does this call for flaps? I don't believe it would, since we're trying to glide. Landing gear down. Oh no, it does flaps down, what do you know? So I guess that's very much like a power off 180 type scenario, where we generally don't put our flaps in, or definitely not our landing flaps, until landing is 100% assured. I did once upon a time try a little something and go engines idle on a Lear 31 from the, I think it was a beam the numbers on the downwind for an airport location and a tail number that will go unnamed, but I was just interested to see what a power off 180 would look like. And I was doing pretty good at maintaining about a 300 and 400 foot per minute descent. Everything looked good, and then my jet instinct to configure trumped my my knowledge, and just the fact that I know better to not put my flaps in until it was configured. But I wanted to slow down, so I called for flaps full, and as soon as I did that, the plane just sank like you wouldn't believe, and I had to bring the power back in. And I did that much. We still had at least 1,000 feet, but as soon as I saw the sink rate, I knew that we were committed. That there was no way I was going to be able to glide it in at that point. Anyway, as I was saying, flaps go down, your engine fire T handles, you'll pull those, start gen switches off, fuel jettison switch off, battery switches. Boy, if you are below 10,000 feet and you lose your engines, that's I doubt you're necessarily going to have a lot of time to run this. Of course, you do have pilot monitoring for a reason. Let's see, there's partial flap landing. Okay, so we talked about no flap landings earlier. And so this falls under, so partial flap landing, final approach speed configuration will be gear down. Your final approach speed is as appropriate. We'll reference the table below. Landing distance as appropriate. Use of drag chute or thrust reversers is recommended because your landing roll will be considerably greater, as will your touchdown speed be much higher. Your GPWIS, your ground proximity warning system flap will be override because it recognizes it as well as saying, hey, you're not in a landing configuration yet, you're awfully low to the ground, heads up. And then if you have a 530 autopilot and your yaw dampener always needs to be turned off before landing in a Lear 35, well, on the older, the 530 you can have it on, but in this situation, because flap setting dictates how much input the autopilot makes, or the yaw dampener makes, so that's why. But if we're, say, flaps up, we can't get them down for whatever reason, it'll be ref plus 30, so and you multiply your landing distance by 1.35, and then flaps 8, ref plus 20, flaps 20, ref plus 10, and so on and so forth. So that's, I think we kind of beat that one to death a little bit, but I think all of you at home kind of get the idea. Let's see. That's nice thing about these emergency checklists is you generally get a systems diagram. Now, I'm a firm believer in understanding these systems and how they operate. This is your pedostatic system, and these have the RVSM high-speed pedo tubes, which most Lears have, but there are a few out there that don't. But I am a firm believer in understanding these systems, and NCAA does a fantastic job of breaking these systems down. They spend a great deal of time and effort doing exactly that. But I also don't believe in utilizing diagrams to start troubleshooting an issue where there's a checklist that doesn't address the issue itself. Because I just think if you start experimenting, you yourself become a test pilot, and unless you know for certain based on experience. But I firmly believe in follow the checklist, and if the checklist says don't do it, unless you just know for a fact, I would say do not deviate and don't do otherwise. I do very much buy into that line of thinking and that training. The word escapes me at the moment. But fuel systems, you can see it has two different fuel systems. The top fuel system is the 36 with a fuselage valve. This fuel system, this was the original, and there's plenty of Lear 35s out there, I believe, that have this still. The top fuel system is the later production. It was also the United States Air Force was actually the one that had Gates LearJet change the fuel system because they saw more or less a single point of failure, which was that if your transfer valve up here failed, then you have got all of this fuel back here that you can't use, which also has CG implications and range implications for everything. But so essentially a single point of failure occurred with this fuel system. That changed with the fuselage valve, that even if you lost your transfer valve, you could open up the fuselage valve. And I believe, there's no pump, but I believe it can be gravity fed. So, a little Lear history for you there. The pitch axis malfunction, that's always a fun one in the simulator, always a fan favorite. This would be something like a pitch trim runaway. Very similar, I'd say, very similar to what happened in the 737 MAX. And we could talk about that for the next 30 minutes and how it relates and how those pilots should have recognized it or didn't recognize it. But I think that's a little bit off topic for this evening's video. But I think we'll call it a night with this operator's handbook for a little, for now at least. For those of you who would like to go over this more, or a different operator's manual, like for the Challenger, or a Citation XL, or another piston, 402 for example, please go ahead and let me know. I'll be happy to. That would be something fun to do. And I like this model, or this topic, where we have this operator's manual and gives us the opportunity to talk about different airplanes and their systems, and I get to geek out a little bit on airplanes. And of course, what I like too is it gives us the opportunity to discuss systems and things about aircraft that you just generally don't get when you watch a normal video about something like a Lear 35A. You know, if you were to watch your standard run-of-the-mill Lear 35A video, it would tell you about, its tip tanks, its legendary design, Bill Lear, his reputation in the industry, some of the, the cabin and the luxuries of the LearJet and how the jet set lifestyle, but doesn't really get too much into the systems and some of the stories about the airplane. Now, I'll probably ramble on for just a few more minutes before we'll say goodbye and good night. But this diagram, if you remember from the cover, it said Lear 35-36. It's the Lear 36 essentially had one mission when it was designed, which was to make a Lear 35 that was able to go from the West Coast to Hawaii. And in order to do so, they had to cram a lot more fuel onto the airplane, so they extended these tip tanks considerably so. I don't know what the actual number is, but it was interesting. I always thought I knew what a Lear 36 looked like based on the pictures, and but it wasn't until I saw one in person that it was like, oh, that's definitely a Lear 36 because these tip tanks extend out considerably. And then they also made the fuselage tank bigger as well. So the cabin space was obviously compromised. You couldn't carry as much baggage, but you could get to Hawaii nonstop. Well, I mean, there's nowhere to stop, so yeah. But that's overall. Aside from that, there's really not much in the way of difference between a Lear 35 and a 36. If you can fly a 35, you can fly a 36. But I believe this airplane was manufactured from, it was either 77 or 70, I think it was 73 or 74 to 1992. So it had a pretty a pretty long run. And as I stated at the beginning of the video, a very storied airplane, very successful airplane, and pilots and owners alike have always loved them. You can pick up a Lear 35A for $300,000 now. That's, terms and conditions apply, and it might need a 12-year, might need new engines, the interior might be beat up. The bulk of these airplanes nowadays are used as air ambulance airplanes, so they definitely get beat up for sure, but they're still happy to do it and happy to fly. They do fly wonderfully, very stable birds, very predictable in how they handle, and just a lot of fun to fly. And for those of you watching, if you ever get the opportunity to go up in one, whether it's a passenger or in the right or left seat, I would definitely recommend it. So I'll at some point put out a poll or a questionnaire just to see how you liked this video, and if you'd like to see more of it, or if you have some ideas for a different aircraft or a different topic. And please feel free to comment, message me what you'd like to see in the future. I hope to have a new video up here shortly. So, as always, thanks for watching. Thanks for flying.